as that progressed and as some of my foundational convictions started to shift and change, which were also very much happening alongside my own divorce, which I can talk more about, it came to become clear that the Episcopal Church was a place that could hold together, or at least tries to hold together, a lot of things that were emerging to be really important to me.
Hi, and welcome to a new year of Feeling Beings Who Think. My name is Ariane Rice, and I am an Episcopal priest and leadership coach. Now, at first thought, you may not think that preaching and coaching have anything in common. I mean, the first is a stylized type of oratory, and it is delivered to a room full of people in the context of a worship experience. Whereas individual coaching is a one-on-one endeavor that serves and supports actionable goals articulated by a client having nothing to do with religion. But as someone who does both, I can tell you they do have a few things in common. Each requires deep and attentive listening that is paired with an ability to ask what in coaching speak are called powerful questions. A powerful question is one that takes you beyond binary thinking. You just can't answer it with a yes or a no. Instead, they are questions that invite and often require some reflection and introspection. A powerful sermon, in my opinion, derives from powerful questions. Not just the questions that the sacred text might raise, but also how does the text speak to the preacher's internal beliefs and convictions? How do the questions that come up touch on or maybe even dig into some hard and vulnerable places? And a coach, with a slightly different methodology, of course, does the same. The coach invites a client to dig into their experiences, including sometimes hard and vulnerable places, in search of their meaning and purpose and their vision for who they are becoming. My guest today is the Reverend Derek Miller, and I asked him to be in conversation with me to share and discuss some of the hard and vulnerable periods in his life, including divorce and leaving one denomination for another. Derek references a well-known book that is about the spirituality of leadership. It's called The Wounded Healer by Henry Nouwen, and in it he writes this: "It is not just curiosity which makes people listen to a preacher when he speaks directly to a man and a woman whose marriage he blesses. They listen in the deep-seated hope that a personal concern might give the preacher words that carry beyond the ears of those whose joy or suffering he shares. Few listen to a sermon which is intended to be applicable to everyone, but most pay careful attention to words born out of concern for only a few." End quote. In coaching speak, I believe that is saying vulnerability is strength, vulnerability is courage. I want to thank Derek for so generously sharing his personal experiences navigating these vulnerable periods in his life, where convictions, frameworks, beliefs, and even identity were rocked by circumstance and often by some powerful questions he chose to ask himself. Okay, thanks for being here, and thank you for listening. You can find Henry Nouwen's book at the Feeling Beings Who Think bookshelf at bookshop.org. And now let's get to today's conversation. Hello, Derek Miller.
Hello, Ariane. Good to see you.
It is good to see you, and thank you in a busy time of year for making time to have a conversation with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the invitation.
Well, I want to say a little bit about how the invitation came about, and then I'll also give a shout out, I guess, to our mutual friend, Josh, because he has a podcast called Rethinking Faith, which if you haven't ever come across it, you might want to check it out. And I went to go check it out in my feed the other day, and the episode was titled, The evangelical to Episcopal pipeline is real. A conversation with Father Derek Miller. And I thought, wait, what? I know a Derek Miller. He's an Episcopal priest in my diocese. And lo and behold, it was you right here in Baltimore. And his podcast originates here in Baltimore, which was all fascinating fun for me.
Yeah, leave it to the internet to help us connect in places that we're actually pretty close to each other, but just hadn't had a chance to do that. So
not at all. And then it also allowed for me to learn a little bit more of your story. And I was unaware of the evangelical to Episcopal background. So I want to talk about that.
Sure.
But then we found ourselves at convention not too long ago. And I don't know what exactly put it into my heart and mind, but I thought, I want to have some conversations with clergy who have been through a divorce. Not necessarily a light topic.
Certainly not. Yeah.
But it's an experience I went through. And I've certainly had a lot of conversations offline and not recorded about it, but am grateful that you accepted an invitation with that as my, invite topic.
Sure. Well, as I think we commiserated a bit, it's not something that is there's not a lot of people having this conversation, at least that I've found. I hope for all of us, as we go through challenging things and heal from them and integrate them and that sort of thing, that we can learn to talk about them in ways that might be helpful for somebody else. So,
yes. And also, hopefully, if you are out there and divorce is a part of your current, present, past, possibly future experience, then I hope you might find some companionship in having that experience normalized, which is really helpful when you're feeling really isolated and alone.
Yes.
So let's not go straight there. Let's maybe start by you saying a little bit about who you are and what you do in the world.
Sure. So I'm Derek Miller. As you mentioned, I'm a priest, serve in the Diocese of Maryland. I'm currently the rector at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Old Ellicott City. And as you mentioned, am somewhat newer to the Episcopal Church tradition. Have a ministry background before coming into the Episcopal Church, where I served in a variety of roles in kind of the Baptist / non-denominational world. Served as like a worship leader and sort of pastor over all the sort of like an administrative pastor, all the things that the other lead pastor didn't want to do or was not gifted at was what I did, right? But yeah, I've been in here at St. Peter's now. I'm in my third year serving as rector there and live in the community as well. I'm now currently married to my wife, Kara, and we have a 3-year-old, three-nager son.
I never heard that before.
Yes, he lives into it. Well, he would want me to say he's at least 3.5 now. That's important. So yeah. That's kind of the short version of me, and
that's
talk
the
more
very
about
short
my story.
version.
Yeah.
Because away, I think to myself, I don't know if you take vows when you're a pastor in some capacity in the Baptist / non-denominational tradition, but you left or separated yourself from that and moved into something else. So maybe tell us a little bit of the story of how you got there to here.
Sure. So I'm not originally from Maryland. I grew up just north of Atlanta, Georgia, and come from a ministry family. So I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and my father is a ordained Southern Baptist pastor. So for most of my life, my dad and my pastor were the same person as far as growing up that way. My mom also comes from a ministry family. Her dad, so my grandfather, is still with us and is retired, and I put that in quotes, as a Southern Baptist pastor. He was also an ordained evangelist, so he would travel around a lot. Not really retired even now in his 90s. He said he's retired just to doing interim work and preaching on Sundays and doing Bible studies on Wednesdays. And I'm like, well, that sounds very familiar to my work. So he's very active. I hope I have his genes. So come from that background. And people always ask me all the time growing up, Derek, are you going to go into the family business? And I would laugh and say, no, not because I think overall I had a a better experience than maybe others might have growing up in the church, but definitely got a front row seat to the less than desirable parts of the church. Growing up in a ministry family and having a dad who is heavily committed to that work, which meant we, many nights not there, or me tagging along doing stuff with him. So I got to see a lot of that and didn't think that was the life that I wanted for myself. But I thought I was going to be a musician and do that for a while. So I was in a smattering of bands all through high school and into college. Thought I was going to go to school for that, but where I wanted to go was incredibly expensive and couldn't afford it. So I kind of bounced around a little bit, joined a band, thought that that was going to be what I did for a little while. And what I realized during that time is what I mostly enjoyed in that. Of course, I enjoyed the performance and it was just a lot of fun. And we played like really hard rock music. But I really enjoyed connecting with these young people who were coming out to our shows. And many of them I would find were finding themselves pretty disaffected from the church, had pain and difficult things they needed to talk about and process with somebody who cared about them. And so, usually we would do that over a crappy cup of coffee at a diner at, 1 a.m. So when we all decided, it's time for us to grow up now and the band couldn't be what we wanted to do, I thought, I think I might want to go into ministry and perhaps in a way that helps to engage with people who are, the term that was used at that time was like the people who are de-churched. So people who have become disaffected and or hurt by church. And so went to a Baptist college because it was cheaper tuition and a very conservative undergrad Bible college. But I studied urban ministry while I was there. And then when I was getting close to graduate, I had a friend someone who had been a previous youth minister at the church I grew up in, who was helping to start a church in Baltimore City and wanted to know if I would be interested in coming and moving and helping with that. And I said, can I do an internship to finish my program? And he said, sure. So that's what brought me to the Baltimore area. This was back in the late aughts, like 2008. So we were a air quotes non-denominational church affiliated with the Baptist Church and a few other kind of evangelical church planting network sort of things. And that's where I cut my teeth in ministry. That's where I unlearned and relearned a lot of things about God and myself. And over the course of that time, felt a calling to ministry, was ordained within this new church, which I was the first person to be ordained in this new church. So I was kind of a guinea pig in that way. We didn't really know quite how to do it. At that time, it didn't require specific formal theological education. I had done some of that on my own. So I did things a bit backwards. I was ordained and then kind of said, well, I think I should finish seminary. And they said, that's a good idea. And so completed my seminary at St. Mary's Ecumenical Institute in Baltimore. And that was really probably the place that the scratching of the itch started for me, of like moving beyond. I've always been interested kind of beyond my theological come from and learning about other traditions. And that just, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, I just loved it and loved having my world opened. And as that progressed and as some of my foundational convictions started to shift and change, which were also very much happening alongside my own divorce, which I can talk more about, it came to become clear that the Episcopal Church was a place that could hold together, or at least tries to hold together, a lot of things that were emerging to be really important to me. And so I left the place I was ordained after pastoring there for a number of years and worked for a nonprofit for a while I was completing seminary. And then through friendship with some people in the diocese who helped and kind of pre-discernment conversations, official discernment, helped me kind of chart that course into the church and then ultimately into the priesthood.
So, I mean, I there's a lot of questions that are coming to mind around, like, you use the word conservative, you use Baptist and non-denominational, and all these words that people may or may not know intimately. And I'm hearing too about theological shifts in your understanding once you studied somewhere else. But I think what I'm most curious about, if you don't mind my answering, is what was it like going home to your Baptist dad and your mom and saying, guess what?
Yeah. Complicated. Yeah. Well, and, I would have to answer that question differently for different members of my family, because each one handled and handles it differently. My dad, it was challenging for him. He had some questions and concerns, which I think more than anything, just like probably any parent, they just need an opportunity to voice and share. And he did that. And I responded to that. And for many of those things, I think that's kind of done now for him. It's like I've said it and he's responded, and all right. What he's always wanted for his kids is for us to really figure out who we are, and like language that he would use of just like serve the Lord in ways that are most in keeping with how we're made. I actually remember, this has been something I've clung to for a while. My dad once or twice wrote a letter to each of us, and in that, my name Derek is like a transliteration of a Hebrew word for way. I think it's in the same proverb of, train a child up in the way that they should go. And so that's often actually kind of misapplied to sort of like, I've determined your way and it's this, and this is how you should go. But the word actually, it's used also in other proverbs of like, consider the way of a bird in the sky, consider a way of the snake, along the sand. It's your given bent, the way you're meant to be in the world as who you are. And so I think probably for him, that's how he helps to make sense of this is something that's in keeping for Derek and how he's made. My mom is a much more gray person as far as instead of black and white. And so she's been a more willing conversational partner in things as they've shifted for me and wanting to understand and that sort of stuff. And, she tunes in to our live stream services at our little Episcopal church every Sunday after she's done at her church, admittedly fast forwards through some parts that she doesn't like or doesn't understand. But she does want to hear my sermons. So there's that.
Let's just pause for a minute and talk about how weird it is when you call home to talk to your parents and they're like, I loved your sermon today.
Yeah, it's weird. Yes.
So bizarre.
It's a new thing, right? Yeah. It's like, I wasn't totally prepared for that. Yeah. So, it's been a process for them, just like it's been a process for me, and so I think I've had.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
But I'm wondering around, like, was the wrestling around, I don't believe this anymore, or was the wrestling around this expression of my belief isn't working anymore?
Yeah, I'd say both in different ways and at different intensities. So there were definitely like, I'll put it this way, prayer really messes with you, and in really good ways, at least it has for me. And I think, in our shared tradition, this is kind of something we really affirm, right? That like prayer is formational. And my short answer for everybody, which maybe a lot of your listeners would have preferred at this point in my story, is how I came into the Episcopal Church, is that it was through prayer. I began praying, utilizing the Book of Common Prayer, particularly the daily office, regularly, even though that wasn't my tradition, because I came to a point in my life where the other resources that I had for my own spiritual life no longer worked, particularly in a difficult time. And that was the beginning of some of my own internal shifts, like my own spirituality shifting, my way of relating to God shifting. And then I think some of those beliefs, or how I held those beliefs, shifted as well. There was that part of it, of kind of a sense of integrity. And some of that had to do with issues around, just theological issues around sacraments, as well as a sense of real sort of significant connection to a tradition and to the church more broadly. And of course, going to an ecumenical institute, like having ways of connecting and interacting with people across traditions that are formalized and valuable became really important to me. And that's not something that's formalized or very valuable in a lot of Baptist denominations.
Well, for an Episcopal clergy person, you come to the Episcopal Church as an ordained person with a lot of different threads of background that I think is probably really helpful for you in your ministry and connecting with people in different ways.
I hope so. Oh, helpful and then I think also befuddling for some people in my congregation too. They're probably still trying to figure me out at times. But yeah, what you mentioned maybe kind of we're alluding to. One of the things that's became important for me too is that not that this solves all or any problems as it relates to issues in the church, but coming into a place where there are kind of multiple layers of sort of authority and accountability is something that I did not experience in the more free church world by design, right?
Right.
And so that was something that continued to sort of trouble me that there wasn't a lot of kind of local or significant accountability for leaders. That's an important thing in the church. It's an important thing everywhere. So yeah, there was also just an emerging sense also of integrity for me of like, is it best for me to be the person that's leading these people in this place and in this tradition? And I had to kind of reckon with that and see that, well, no, I don't think, I think that where I'm feeling pulled is not necessarily where this community is feeling pulled. And also it was a community that had shown itself, and I don't mean this disrespectfully at all, but not really able to sort of discern with me what was going on. And so
was discernment like a word? And like discernment to me is used a lot in Episcopal.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It's the idea of thoughtful, prayerful decision making.
Yeah. I mean, they would have used other language for it of like prayer or like, you know, what is the Spirit saying to you? I mean, similar things, but I think more of like a framework or even kind of a practice of it wasn't as much there. So for me, a question that was raising up for me was not, am I called to fulfill this particular role in this place? But how has God made me and who am I called to be? And when I realized that what was most needed at that time, or what was communicated to me at that time was needed, is like, we need to kind of know if you feel like you're called to this or not. It was very binary, and that's okay. And for me, I realized, well, I can't answer that question with a strong affirmative yes. And if that's what is needed, then it's best that I move into further exploring that question.
Was not having an answer to that question something, how do I say this? Sometimes I feel more sure when I know I don't know. Sometimes uncertainty is a preferable place to be than planting my, flag, planting my stake in something. And I'm curious if this time of uncertainty was very comfortable for you. You were like, I'm actually a lot more comfortable saying I don't know than claiming yes, just to keep everybody in agreement here or something.
Yeah, probably. And also certainty, is a pretty high value in Baptist and evangelical spaces, and is rewarded and lifted up, right? There's like some core convictions about, we're very certain about this about scripture, or about this about what the church should look like, or this about, all things that have to do with eternity. There's some strong certainty that's attached to that. And so yeah, when all that's been disrupted along with some other things, and you're trying to figure out how you live in that, yeah, it gets complicated.
It does.
It's difficult.
And you're just reminding me that not too long ago, I had a conversation with somebody from a different religious tradition. And they said to me, what I like about my tradition is it tells me what we believe, period. And I thought, I just, nodded my head and smiled, because I definitely like that in my tradition. Certain beliefs are shared with me. Certain church beliefs are shared with me, but I don't have to always be told what one I am supposed to believe. I get to discern and think and pray and bring my own experience to it.
Yes, but also like that in and of itself doesn't make it a threat for you to belong or engage, right?
Right, so exactly.
So for me, like, there's actually a lot of comfort for me that comes from a fact that every week we do confess a faith that we've received, right? And that is handed down to us, and that in some ways, well, in a variety of ways, we all affirm and hold to and acknowledge. And perhaps that was a part of what I was seeking out was, and I mean, I'm sure, we're my therapist on the call. We could, talk more about all the ways this
if we had both of our therapists on the call, that would be really a good conversation.
But, ways in which that particularly intersects with my own personality type and my own story. And I've not done much work with the Enneagram, but to the extent that I have, like, my number, I'm a pretty strong 6. And so there's a sense of like safety and security that can come from having sort of external authority and clear guidelines. So that maps pretty well onto a tradition like ours, or it can, at least it does for me.
I do want to highlight, in case people don't know what we're referring to, that every week we say the Nicene Creed, as do all Catholic traditions. And I know lots of people who struggle with saying that because they're like, we don't believe all of these things concretely. But I love that you said we're affirming something that the church has believed over time.
Right. So there's like maybe you've heard this as well as like in other communities of faith or just anywhere else, like there's a sense of like, well, I have to sort of like believe something before I can belong somewhere. And I'd say that in many Baptist and non-denominational church contexts for the most part, and I'm painting with a broad brush, but like, you believe something and your beliefs indicate that you belong here, right? So you have a
Yes, got
particular
it.
confession of specific, faith statement, that sort of thing. What I've come to appreciate, and frankly, now I must have a sign on my forehead at my church because we've had a lot of other people who are coming into the Episcopal Church from other traditions, many of whom kind of more in the evangelical stream, who really have articulated in one way or another that they feel as though they belong right
Mhm.
away, even if they don't fully believe, or even if they might never fully believe, but that they love that there's a way for them to belong, to connect, to serve, to engage before having to sort of sign their name on some sort of dotted line.
Yeah, I think if
Yeah.
there's one measure of what draws people to a faith community, it's that word belonging. We all want to belong in the
Yeah.
spaces that we inhabit, and we all want to discover new places to belong. And so, how was your ministry journey paralleling or incorporating your first marriage? Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about those two strands?
Sure. So I met my first wife in that process of beginning Bible college. In that environment, and I know this can exist in others as well, but in that there's definitely a high premium placed upon like people finding their mate
Mm.
and getting married as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
uh, it's jokingly referred to as like women getting their MRS, right? Like
Yeah.
the whole, yeah, or ring by spring, like it's a whole thing.
Oh, wow, I haven't heard
And
that.
no, I actually remember, and I wish I was joking when I told you this, but like the dean of the seminary, when he had like let's just have a guys talk with these young guys, he basically said, listen, guys, this is your chance. And your criteria are pretty standard. Like, is she hot and does she love Jesus? Then you need to marry her. And I was like, he
Wow.
just said that out loud.
Wow.
Okay, he said it out loud. So that was a big part of the environment in which I was in.
Well, clearly it was also like, you better believe this if you want to belong here.
Right. Yes. Well, and certainly tapped into that whole sense of belonging, right? Like all of our friends were getting married, in their very early 20s, or not even yet early 20s. And so yeah, we did get married. We had not been married yet a full year before we moved to Baltimore. So we were a part of that first kind of group of folks with this church. We intentionally moved there together.
Can I interrupt and ask a question?
Sure.
When you got married, did you think this will be this forever statement that I'm making? Did you have reservations? Did you wonder? Did you think you were doing something because it's what was expected of you? Like, what would, if you can remember some of those swirling?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember there being like significant doubts. I think I did think, because that's how it was framed for all of us,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I was definitely swimming in some really what I would now refer to as pretty toxic streams around understanding around gender roles and marriage and toxic masculinity stuff, like wives submit to your husbands, like a lot of that kind of, that's what I grew up in. I'd like to think that I didn't fully subscribe to all of that when we got married. We would kind of poke at fun at a lot of that stuff too. But yeah, I thought this was it. Yeah. But of course, like the thing that was always presented to us is that, like, well, actually remember this. We had to take a class on marriage and the family in my Bible college. And one of the things, is like, God created marriage not to make you happy, but to make you holy. And what they meant by that was that relationships like, and uniquely like marriage, are hard and can be ways that we are, I'll use another theological term, but we are a means of our sanctification or our growth, right? It challenges us. It pulls out all of our stuff, right? It's hard to hide yourself in a marriage. And so there's an opportunity to deal with all of that. So yeah, I definitely thought it was going to be a lifetime, and would have intended that in my particular situation. My wife had made the decision pretty clear that she was not happy and wanted to leave. And that's not something that I had articulated or wanted. That was something that she initiated.
How long had you been married?
We'd been married like 2.5 years at that point.
2.5 years. And you were completely like out. This was out of the blue for you.
As it happened, yes. I mean, I don't want to paint a rosy picture. We had problems, I think, like many couples probably do, especially ones that probably were not well prepared for making this commitment. And when your standard is love of Jesus and physical attractiveness, like that's not really a lot of prep. So it was definitely challenging, especially also like moving to a new context. We were both removed from our families. They lived far away, didn't have a lot of supportive friendships, at least to start, when we came there.
Sorry, but this just makes me realize, as I'm thinking a little bit about my own experience, because I was also relatively young. Certainly now it seems really young. I was 24 when I got married for the first time. But I think we really, there really is a lot of pressure to get married. Like, even though it's 2023.
Yes.
And
there was a high premium placed on marriage, like, which is really interesting also for a tradition that like really holds up scripture is like really being high and authoritative, where like somebody like St. Paul is like, don't get married.
Yeah, exactly.
It's better that you not. So yeah, there's a high premium placed on it for a couple of reasons. One, especially in my time, high prevalence on purity culture. Like, you got to do this so that you can have, a sexual outlet. Like that's why you need to get married. And they wouldn't have said it this directly, but it was kind of held up as this sort of, it's a rite of passage. It's self-actualization. Like it helps to reaffirm your value to society. I mean, there's a lot that's sort of coded into that. And kind of by negative example, like if you remain single past a certain age, then there's definitely something wrong with you, right? I mean, that's kind of built into even how some churches would structure their ministries. Like you have in certain places sort of age-based ministries. And so like once you're out of sort of college age, it's like, well, now there's the young couples class, and then there's the singles ministry, which is everybody from people who have just graduated college to people who are maybe recently divorced and everywhere in between. And, at least in the church that I grew up in, there was a lot of kind of, we don't know what to do with that. So yeah, I think the pressure is definitely there.
It also is a way of locking in or guarding against uncertainty.
Certainly. Yes.
That's one of the things I think about when I think about how important it was for me to get married. It's just like I could lock it in. Didn't have to worry about that part anymore.
Well, I think it became a sort of a standard bearer of like a certain level of maturity, maybe too.
Yes.
Like you're kind of viewed as, so like when people are also talking about graduating and applying for jobs, like I think there were probably a lot of churches that would have preferred to be looking for someone who is married as opposed to single for different positions in ministry and otherwise. And so, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of pressure built into that.
Okay, so your then wife lets you know that she doesn't think this marriage is going to work, and then what?
Yeah, I mean, it happened very, very directly and very calmly. It wasn't even just that it's not going to work, but like I'm letting you know that I'm leaving it. I'm leaving, and I don't want you to try to make that better. I don't want you to try to chase after me. I'm leaving, and I wanted to let you know that. Like as calmly as I told you, it was a very very surreal experience. I was 2 months into my first full-time ministry job when this happened.
Wow.
So I didn't sleep most of that weekend and couldn't be in my home. She was staying elsewhere. But again, so baked into me, I think of like, I don't want this to be disruptive for other people. And there's probably a whole thing to talk about around that.
There is.
That I was like, so at the time I was a worship leader and kind of helped to coordinate all of our church gatherings. So we had 2 Sunday morning services. My job was to lead the music and like coordinate volunteers and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't want to tell my pastor at the time because I didn't want to disrupt him because, he had 2 sermons to preach that day. And, I didn't want to bother him with this. I was so, worked up about it, somehow made it through the first service, went into the bathroom and like vomited in between the first and second service and like cried, got that out of my system. Well, had the moment, and then went back and did the second service, and then finally like worked up the courage to basically tell my pastor what had happened. And, he was very gracious and said, like, come hang out with me at our house. Like after church, let's just spend time together, have lunch with us. Let's talk. And yeah, I mean, that was,
I'm grateful you had that response.
yes, I am too. I think in many ways I was more blessed and in some ways really surprised by the support that I received and support that was offered to her too. Again, I mean, I wish I could say that was the case the whole time. It wasn't from everybody. I mean,
well, you raise an important point about saying to yourself, okay, this decision, I got to make sure it doesn't disrupt like too many other people's very busy lives or hurt them. Because,
right.
For anybody who's thinking about this decision these days, I remember doing something so similar. I was pretty clear and we kind of both knew what was happening. And I was like, well, I can't tell anybody now because we're in our annual stewardship campaign and then it's Christmas. And then so I better just wait on it because it is this horrible timing for everybody else.
Yes.
I don't know if you had to live fake for a little while, but that was pretty hard.
Yeah. I mean, I couldn't last long with it fake. I mean, because it was just really painful. And as I mentioned earlier, like very disruptive to my faith as well. And so, part of what I was being asked to do every Sunday is to like, lead people in worship and like sing these things about God that, God's great. And I'm so in love with everything that God is doing in the world. When on the inside, I'm like, I still believed in God. I was just really pissed off at God.
Yes.
I was just really angry. Like we
Yep.
weren't talking for a while.
I totally was like that too.
Yeah. Because I also at that time had a pretty wooden understanding of like God's engagement in the world. And the school that I went to was pretty heavily on the sort of like reformed Calvinistic end.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of emphasis on God's sovereignty and control over all things. And so that can be a really painful thing of saying, well, like, how is God in control and sovereign in this? But
what was it like going to tell your parents?
Oh, I felt very ashamed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Felt like it was, that I had let them down. And so that was one of the first things I did that afternoon. I hadn't told my parents all weekend. And then I went to my pastor's house and we talked and I was like, hey, I think I just need to go in the other room and like call my parents and tell them, and a lot of tears, and they were shocked, but also communicated like love to me as well. And, didn't always know the right thing to say or what to say, but,
I mean, that word shame, right. It's hard to say the right thing. And I've learned sometimes like, sometimes people would say to me like, I'm so sorry. And I was like, but there's nothing to be sorry about. It's just a really difficult topic.
Yes.
To talk about. And that shame piece.
Yeah. So yeah, there was shame. And then there was definitely anger. So like, cause people would say really stupid stuff to me and not intentionally, I don't think, or really not just stupid, but like hurtful things. Mm-hmm. So for a while I kept a list of all the stupid and hurtful things that people said to me because I needed to put it somewhere.
Right. So what are some of the things? Let's hear some of the list.
Okay. Yeah. So, and this was probably one of the more painful things. Well, I'll start my more silly side of like, Derek, God just works everything together for good. Or God knew this was going to happen. God's still on the throne. I really believe God's going to save your marriage. And then one of the more painful ones was from someone who was a close friend, and we've since reconciled over this and talked about it. And he apologized actually, but he said, Derek, I think you want to think that this isn't your fault, but it is. And you need to take some time to really think about what your role is in this that has caused this to happen. And it's time for you, this is the one, to reclaim your wife. was
Oh,
the
wow.
language she said. And I think I shared this with our friend too on his podcast, but I said, I'm very proud of my response. I said, my ex-wife, or my soon to be ex-wife, is not in coat check.
Oh,
I cannot reclaim her. That is not how this works. If God wasn't working anywhere, I'd like to think that that was a spirit inspired response
yes,
as
I
well.
agree.
Yeah, a little prophetic edge. Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of that kind of stuff, or people just asking way too personal questions.
Mm-hmm.
What happened? What did she do? What did you do?
Mm.
Like,
As wanting to find the reason for it, wanting to
well, because
find
they're trying
something.
to make sense out of it,
Right,
right? I mean, this
exactly.
is the thing that I had to come to learn, is that this is disruptive for me in my way, but this is disruptive for others in their way,
Mm-hmm.
in ways that may or may not have to do with how it's disruptive for me,
Oh, exactly. That's really an
right?
important point.
And that doesn't give them the right or the permission to visit that disruption on me and have me then help them figure that out,
Mm-hmm.
which is often what would happen. But yeah, I had to just kind of recognize, like, okay, they're this is messing with them. They're grieving this too, or this is disrupting a way that they've thought about the world.
Derek, I just want to really highlight this mature wisdom because it's really important. It's taken me, I know I'm older than you, so it took me a little bit longer. And I just recorded a conversation around the connection between expectations and resentments. And one of the takeaways that relates is people are entitled to have whatever reaction they want or need or are able to have, but I don't have to take it personally.
Yeah,
And that's hard to do.
it is.
I say it out loud because it's so important for me to remember too.
It is. It is. And so, for me, a way to manage that, a strategy for me was writing it down, because I kind of needed to, like, not carry it in me anymore and, like, put it somewhere. And then after a period of time, I deleted the whole thing because I didn't need that around anymore. It was kind of my way now, thinking back on it, like an embodied way of saying, I'm not going to hold that for them.
Well,
Like,
I mean, for someone who wasn't yet Episcopal, it's also a ritualized way.
yes. Yeah.
And I think those kinds of rituals really matter.
They do. And it was actually during this time where I think that reconnection, or that connection to ritual spirituality, emerged for me. So what I realized is that, for example, our Sunday morning worship experiences and times together were no longer really they were actually quite draining for me. And so I had to find other ways to connect with God, because that was not going to be my primary way of doing that. So for me, I mentioned prayer being a part of that, and praying the office, but also I just went wherever I could find anyone who would serve me communion. I would go, because there was also a ritual act for me I call it a transition for me from Baptist to Episcopalian, of taking communion versus receiving communion.
I love that.
And so, like, for me, I was raised taking communion. We would do it maybe once a month or quarterly, with the little cups that many of us got familiar with during the time of the pandemic, right? The little shot glasses of Jesus, and little piece of bread. But what I was feeling was so helpless, so lost, and so exhausted that, to me, I felt like all I could do was kind of take my hands and just hold them out.
Right.
And just say, I need whatever I can get.
Were you in touch? Like, at the time, could you verbalize the reality that you were grieving?
Say more about that. Wait, I want to make sure I understand the question.
It took me a while to give myself permission to grieve the marriage not working, and to grieve letting go of a lot of expectations I had about my future. I did have a daughter. I mean, she was 8 when we got divorced. I had to grieve not giving her what I anticipated being able to give her. I had to grieve, days without her, which I definitely did not anticipate when I became a mom. In a way, it's like I had to grieve a whole identity of myself that I thought existed, but now is going to be completely changed.
I definitely think that was a process for me too. My experience didn't have some of the other dynamics that you mentioned. We didn't have children. And so I recognize that as such a unique and ongoing challenge for a lot of people going through a divorce with children. Our marriage also it wasn't very long. I don't know if that has something to do with it or not, but I did definitely grieve a lot of that. It's a loss of sense of how you had imagined yourself to be, a loss of a sense of the future and what dreams you had. So that came in waves. It's a really good question, Ariane. I appreciate it because it's getting me to think a little bit more about. I think there were different moments on the timeline where I think I became aware of those different things to grieve. I think one of the things that about my own situation that might have been more unique. I mean, it was a pretty clear end. I mean, it was
Right.
just very sudden and very
Definitive.
definitive. Yes, I know that's a pain for others of like a marriage that is in the process of ending or going through a divorce itself that is very complicated to
Right.
resolve. And there were definitely some of those complications that came later, but there was a lot of it that felt very intense up front for me in those first few months, especially.
What is it like? I'm assuming, and I'm assuming that you've done premarital counseling with people.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like for you? Because I sometimes, have a variety of feelings around the fact that I'm a person doing premarital counseling who has been divorced.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very aware of that. There's kind of like, there's maybe three different things that come to mind. The first is like, yes, I'm a person that has been divorced. I'm also now a person that is remarried and has I like to think, very healthy marriage from which I can draw.
Yes.
And so I'm grateful for that. And that's a gift. I am also aware that there have been couples that I have counseled where I'm like, I don't know about this. And I've had to say, had to be like, is this connecting to some of my own history and things, what is this kind of triggering in me? And then the third thing, honestly, is that I refer out a lot of my premarital counseling.
Me too. That's exactly right.
Yeah, because of my own story in some ways, but also like I'm not a professional. And, depends on who it is and kind of what the dynamic of the relationship is and all of that. And I, of course, want to be pastoral. That's a part of that role. And so I engage in that, but I'm not the one to sort of like help them hash through like all their family system stuff.
Right.
And like, like I'm not certified to do that. I'm not qualified to do that. And so in some ways I feel like I actually might be doing perhaps the same disservice that was done to me in my first marriage. Which is that I didn't get much, except, go through a book with a bunch of other young couples, them basically saying, oh, you'll be fine. You'll figure it out,
Well, and there's also the reality, which I tell myself sometimes in these premarital conversations, as you referred to, we all have a way to go. And we are going to learn things on that way. And some of them we're going to learn because something didn't work.
Yes.
Or it was only supposed to work for a certain period of time. And then that's as long as it could work for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So one of the reasons that I have a podcast called Feeling Beings Who Think is because I do believe so much of my faith understanding comes from some examination of the feelings I move through all day long, and especially around difficult experiences. And I am curious, how has that experience, how has the experience of the divorce, how has it informed your faith? How has it informed your understanding of your relationship with God? And
yeah. I mean, that's such a big question. I think it's helped me really, it's provided an opportunity for me to live out the truth that I read about in Henri Nouwen's The Wounded Healer, where I think that the faith tradition that I was raised in, and also perhaps just the society in which I grew up in, also growing up kind of like a middle-class kid in the 80s and 90s, like we are not comfortable sort of letting, the deepest wounds of ourselves, like letting other people have access to that,
right,
or see it. And this was not a welcomed opportunity for me to learn that. But it is one that has helped me to see that really is the place of deep connection with other people and with God, is when we, whatever woundedness we have, whatever pains we have, and we all have them, that actually I found some of them, the deepest relationships and the deepest places of connection with people who were willing to meet with me in their place. I had a wonderful member of the church who was able to, because of an experience she had walking with her family, of being able to articulate what it's like to have people in the church harm you when something is happening to you that you don't have control over.
Mm.
And I think whereas before I would have wanted to run away from that or hide that or not talk about it, it's allowed me to, in ways that are appropriate and, not like, what's the word, performative or icky,
Mm-hmm.
to be vulnerable about those things and find that to actually be the place of God's work. And so in that, it expanded my experience of like, well, God is at work in perhaps especially so the messiest and most painful things that we're experiencing. That gives us, I think, a place of access and identification with God in ways that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And that those can be experiences from which we can draw to meet others. And I don't know, I found that to be true now more than ever in providing pastoral care to other people, where when they are going through and are willing to share vulnerably their pain, I have something. It's not analogous. I'm not trying to over-identify with them or work through my own stuff by working with them through theirs, but it's just an access point. I can get there.
Right. Right.
And on most days, I feel really grateful for that, actually, which is a weird thing to say out loud. I feel and feel honored. And we kind of have a sixth sense about these sort of things, don't we? Like whether somebody's actually like really gone through something or not. I don't have to hide from what's happening in my life. I don't have to turn away from it, but I can actually move more deeply into it and not fear that I will lose myself or God in the process.
Well, thank you for that very thoughtful answer to my question. But it occurs to me that, in both the conservative tradition and in the Episcopal tradition, the majority of our spoken prayers, especially the prayers that we say in community, they're always so focused on the Almighty, the powerful, that sovereign, as you used. And
yes,
and they're beautiful prayers. But I do think we might utilize or figure out, and maybe I should get to trying to compose some more prayers that speak to the reality of, we have a very wounded God. We have a very weak God. We have a very vulnerable God, at least the way in which he came into the world and left the world.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's why for me, like, I remember actually having a conversation with one of my professors about this at St. Mary's, because I, not having grown up in a tradition, perhaps like you did, where we observed Lent or really leaned into Advent practices more than just lighting some candles or whatever, I really got into that of like, and he said, well, Derek, aren't these sort of like penultimate to the thing? Like Advent is leading to Christmas, and Christmas is a big deal, and Lent is leading to Easter, and Easter is a big deal. And I'm like, but I don't think we can really fully grasp or engage with like these significant sort of celebratory moments if we can't also engage in the times leading up to them where we long for them, but they're not here yet. I think it helps to get at what you're talking about more, the true frailty of our experience, and the fact that as Christians, we believe that like Jesus entered into that frailty, like that was our, I think our Franciscans say, like incarnation was already salvation.
Yeah.
Right? Like God becoming us in all those ways. So I think that's actually been a really important thing that I've learned, or I'm still learning through this experience. So much more to be said about that by
so much more to be said.
By people who could probably say it better than I did. But anyway.
Well, thank you for making time for this conversation around some pretty personal topics. So I really appreciate your sharing, because I do think we're both trying to do this for mutual support of other people. And as I told you before, I just think more clergy need to be seen for the whole humans that they are. I think that's really valuable.
Yeah. So I could just maybe offer an encouragement for anyone who
Please.
is kind of in the midst of that. And I mean, I have people I know who are, it can feel incredibly isolating. And so I think it is so important to find your people, your couple people that you can really just, you need them.
Yes.
And you don't know that you need them maybe all of the time, but find them, reach out to them. Don't worry about necessarily saying or not saying, saying the right things or the wrong things or whatever, or worry about how they're going to have to process this.
Mm-hmm.
Give them the opportunity to say yes or no to providing that support, but do ask for it and lean into it. It just continues to amaze me, the space that's made when you kind of say, this is what's going on for me, of what that can create, that allowed for some other opportunities for with other friends who have gone through similar things. And it's a very holy space that can be created when we take that step. Yeah.
Amen. Well, thank you so very much. And, till next time.
All right. Thanks again.